So I built this workbench back when I first moved into my old workshop, probably around 6 years ago. And honestly, it's done a great job. It's sturdy, it's been through a lot, and I never really had any major complaints. But now that I moved into a bigger space, it feels like the right time for an upgrade, something better and heavier. This table has steel legs and a particle board top, and my original plan was to replace the top once it gets all scratched up and worn out. But honestly, that never really happened. Instead, it just got more and more seasoned, which I actually kind of like. But there's a problem. You see, once this kind of surface gets scratched, it becomes vulnerable to moisture. If it gets wet, it swells up and starts to warp. And while that's not the end of the world, it does mean that the surface is no longer perfectly flat, which has annoyed me a few times. So for my next workbench, I want a steel top, not just any kind of steel top. I want something flat. Now there are proper welding tables out there that are nice and flat, but I also want something ridiculously heavy. And after years of keeping an eye out, I finally found the perfect thing. A 1,200 kilos cast iron surface plate. These are typically used for precision work, but as you can see from the rust, it's had a bit of a rougher life. I think at some point someone just started using this as a regular work table, which is fine with me because that's exactly what I need this for. It's big, 2 meters by 1 meter, and most importantly, dead flat. This is going to be super useful for laying out parts, assembling things precisely, and just having a ridiculously overbuilt work surface. Now, of course, I can't just slap this thing on any old base. Right now, it's sitting on a wooden frame, which, let's say, it's seen better days. I mean, I could repaint it, but that wouldn't fix the real problem. I just don't trust it. And considering that dropping 1,000 kilos worth of table is something I'd rather not experience, I'm going to weld up a new base from steel. Before I get to that though, I want to clean up the surface, and since it's cast iron, the rust shouldn't be too deep. But before I go at it with an angle grinder, I want to try something a little less dusty. I'm going to experiment a bit with citric acid. The idea is to soak some cloth in a citric acid solution, lay it all over the rust, and let it sit overnight. It might work, it might do nothing. Either way, we'll find out tomorrow, so let's get started. As you can see, the cloth I used to soak up the citric acid solution is now much darker and has a rusty color, which might be a good sign. So I remove everything and clean up the residue on the surface of the table. And now I can start working on it with the angle grinder and a wire wheel attachment. Right away I realized that the surface finish isn't exactly what I want. I really want to get down to bare metal, so I switched to a surface conditioning tool, and this works much better, letting me reach clean steel underneath with very little effort. I go over the entire table, and yes, this did raise quite a bit of rust and it took a while, but I'm very happy with the result. Next, I use the angle grinder with a regular grinding disc to remove a few weld marks and spots on the surface, and once that's done, I refine the overall finish using a Scotch-Brite pad on the grinder. And now that it's all clean, on the edge of the table you can still see some of the original tooling marks from when this surface plate was manufactured. These are long strips that run along the length of the side, likely made by a planer to square everything up. And with all the rust gone, this surface is much cleaner, but it also reveals a lot more pitting, nicks and cuts than I initially expected. This isn't a problem really, but they're definitely more visible now. So to improve the overall look, I decided to apply a forced patina. First I wipe the table down with alcohol, then spray on a cold blue solution. The cast iron instantly turns jet black, which always looks cool, but as soon as it dries, the surface looks uneven and slightly rusty. But that's normal. Cold blue ink reacts with the steel, creating a thin oxidation layer and making it slightly porous, allowing oil to soak in for protection. While not the most durable on its own, a thick coat of oil locks in the finish and prevent rust. I let it soak overnight, then wipe off the excess and buff it with steel wool for a more natural steel look. The last step is cleaning up the sides. First, I scrub everything thoroughly with the greaser, then I remove some weld marks, just like I did on the surface, and clean out the holes on the sides. These holes, by the way, were probably used for lifting the table with a crane. Finally, I wipe everything down with alcohol, and to ensure the best surface prep before painting, I apply a coat of rust converted. I decided not to strip the sides down to bare metal because the existing paint is likely lead-based and I really don't want to breathe that in. Plus, it's still well adhered to the surface, so there's no real need to remove it. The rust converter will take care of any remaining rust, and once it's dry, I scab the surface with a Scotch-Brite pad and apply 3 coats of industrial-grade paint. So the surface plate restoration is done, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. I have to admit, I love this thing. Now it's time to move on to the legs. Normally, I just start welding things up as I go. But this time, the steel for this project was pretty expensive. 280 euros actually. And that's because I went for some thick walled tubing, and most of the steel I'm using is 6 millimeters thick, since I wanted this table to be a beast and it needed sturdy legs to match the table and of course support the weight adequately. Now, because the steel was so pricey, I decided to do a little 3D modeling for the legs first. That way I knew exactly what pieces I needed to cut. No waste metal, and definitely no buying more. And speaking of cutting, I did it all with my small metal cutting band, so let me tell you, it was quite the effort. It took me a while, but hey, we got the job done, and now all the pieces are here, cut, and ready to be welded. Actually, before welding everything up, there are a couple of preparation steps to take care of. The first is beveling all the edges of the tubing for welding. Then, on a few pieces, I needed to drill holes on one side. These holes are drilled and countersunk on the Bridgeport mill and then tapped for M12 fasteners. These are for mounting the side-to-side locking features between the legs and the table, so these parts here. The side locks were made from 6mm by 100mm steel plate. I cut them to size and notched using the metal cutting bandsaw and then cleaned everything up on the belt grinder. By the way, what you're watching here is the fabrication of the plates for 4 of the feet that will have mounting holes, but the process was exactly the same for the side locks. And here they are. I made 8 side locks and 4 feet with mounting holes, all made pretty much the same way. And now I'm finally ready to start welding. I begin by cutting off the bottom of the upright leg sections. I tuck them in place with a TIG welder, then I switch to stick welding to fill them in. It's just way quicker, and since I'm grinding everything flush later anyway, I don't really care about how the weld looks at this stage. Here you can see I've cut all 6 legs on one side, and now they are all set up in a jig to ensure squareness and also that all the pieces are of the same length. Then I tack weld the top caps onto the upright section, and as you can see, everything turned out pretty flat and level. And now I can start assembling the 2 side frames. These are put together directly on the surface plate, which ensures everything stays nice and square. You are already watching me tack things in place, but before that I did spend a lot of time squaring everything and double-checking measurements, I really took my time with this part. As since I needed to make two identical long-size assemblies, instead of measuring everything again for the second one, I just laid the pieces directly on the first, that way I could ensure that they were the same without needing to measure anything twice. Next, I flipped everything upside down on the surface plate and started welding the cross members. These are the short side and there are 3 of them. Again, I took my time in making sure everything stayed square throughout the process, and once all the pieces were tucked in place, I took the frame off the surface plate and did the full welds with stick welding. There were so many welds that by the end of it, I was actually getting a ton of practice and my weld started to look half decent. Definitely the best stick welds I've ever done. After finishing all the welding, I ground everything smooth and flat and then put the frame back onto the table to weld the final pieces. These are angle irons, and first they add structural support to the bottom half of the table, and second they will also hold a shelf. This kind of steel sheet grid here will be the shelf itself. I cut it to size with the angle grinder and it slides from the short side, resting perfectly on the angle iron supports. Now, with the fabrication done, I can prep for painting. First, I covered the surface plate for protection, then I placed the legs back on top, but I also put a few bolts under the leg to keep them slightly raised so they don't stick to the plastic cover. Then, after degreasing and thoroughly cleaning the steel, I applied 2 good coats of black paint all over. Here we are, the leg frames are finally complete and painted. And now that they're all black, they're looking sweet. I am really happy with how it turned out, so we can move on to the final step of this project, positioning the legs and putting the table on top. There's just one small problem. My pallet jack can't handle both the frame and the table together. It's just way over the weight limit. And that's actually why I left this gap between the frame and the table. It allows my pallet jack to slide in between so I can lift and position the table without needing any extra lifting equipment. So let's get this done. First, I'll move the old table out of the way, and then I position the frame and finally move the surface plate on top of it. But before that, there's one last piece of the puzzle. I'm cutting some thin plywood squares to go between the table and the legs. The idea here is that these will help compensate for any slight imperfection. On the underside of the table, the surface might not be perfectly flat, but the plywood could deform and adapt, ensuring a solid and even connection. Okay, so the table is fully assembled now and it's looking great. But there's one small problem. It's not leveled. Now, the frame itself is perfectly square, so the issue is with the concrete floor. It's uneven, sloping slightly in this direction, which throws off the table level. And actually, I knew about this since my previous workbench had the same exact issue in this position. My original plan was to shim under the legs wood or steel pieces, and while that works, I don't really like the idea or the solution for a heavy-duty workbench like this one. What I should have done from the start is design the legs with adjustable feet, but no big deal, I can still fix it. It will just take a bit of extra work. So first I need to remove the surface plate and set it aside. Then I flip the frame over and make the adjustable feet. So let's get back to work. The idea behind the adjustable feet is simple. I have nuts welded on the bottom of the legs and then a bolt with a swivel base that can be threaded in or out to fine-tune the table's height. And with 6 points of adjustment, I'll be able to get it perfectly level, I think. So first, as you can see, I drilled a hole on the bottom of the leg. This hole is slightly larger than the diameter of the bolt I'm using, an M16 by the way. Then I thread a nut onto the bolt to protect the internal threads while welding. I tuck it in place and weld it all the way around. And after that, of course, I smooth out the welds for a clean finish. And while I machine the swivel feet on the lathe, let's talk about strength. Even a single M16 bolt is more than capable enough of supporting the entire table's weight. So the bolts may look small compared to the cross-section of the leg, but in reality it is way overkill for this application. Really, there's no real risk of stripping the threads, and with 6 of them, even if 1 or 3 were to fail, which is highly unlikely, the table isn't going anywhere. Here you can see the 3 components that make up each adjustable foot. The bottom disc can swivel, and I lock it in place with a nut welded onto the bolt. And this is to provide a way to tighten or loosen the bolt while it's under the table, and here is how everything fits together. Finally, I apply a good coat of paint on all the parts for rust prevention, and now that they're installed, I'm happy to report that they work great. Alright, so now that the adjustable feet are in place, the table is perfectly level and I'm really happy with how it turned out. Actually, flipping the table over to install them turned out to be a good thing, since it gave me a chance to paint some areas I couldn't reach the first time. And as a bonus, the feet also raised up the table a little bit. Now it stands at exactly 1 meter, which I really like. And the only reason it was shorter before was because I had to work within the length of the steel I could get. I bought the steel for the legs in 3-meter sections, so I just made them as long as possible within that limitation. Now, I have to say, building such a heavy-duty table was an incredible amount of work. I've never welded such thick steel structure before, and it honestly surprised me how physically demanding this kind of fabrication work really is. So huge respect to everyone working in metal fabrication field, because wow, this stuff is way more exhausting than it looks. But at the same time, I'm really glad that I went with such a solid base for this table, because I have the feeling that this thing would be with me for the rest of my life. It's definitely a buy once, cry once kind of deal. And speaking of that, let's talk about cost. The surface plate itself was 600 euros plus another 300 for shipping. The steel for the frame was about 280 euros, as I mentioned earlier in the video. Then there were around 100 euros in consumables like welding rods, grinding disc, that kind of stuff, and about 30 euros in paint. So in total, this table ended up costing a little over 1,300 euros. Definitely not cheap, but considering what I got out of it, I think it was worth every cent. Now, one last thing, I just realized that the 2 gaps I left in the frame for the pallet jack could actually be turned into drawers, and since I have 2 long gaps, that means I could fit 4 drawers, like 2 on each side, but I'm not sure if I actually want to add them. So what do you think? Would it be worth putting drawers in here, or should I just leave it as is? Let me know in the comments what would you do? And I think that's it. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you soon in the next project. Bye bye.